Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I am June Archer, and I want to welcome you here to our town hall. Time to rip off the Band-Aid. I want to introduce my guest this evening in no real particular order, but I'd like to introduce Brother Frank Harris III, Chief SNEED, Chief RIDDICK, Vernon Thompson, Reverend Mercado, sorry. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this evening for this town hall. I want to start by saying, for those who are tuned in, those who are listening, watching on YouTube and Facebook, please, if you have comments, please leave them here. If you have questions, we will try to get to them. And I just want to say today makes the 10th straight day of protest regarding what we have seen with George Floyd. Today was also memorializing him for his passing. I am proud of the protests, but I am not proud of the distraction and destruction of our communities. So with that said, I would like to send this over to Brother Harris, who is in the media, Hartford Current. From your perspective, Brother Harris, and I want to say those who are watching, listen, this forum is honorees of the 100 Men of Color Black Tie Gala and Award. It is no slight to anyone. These men are here for a reason, and I am excited to have them. Brother Harris, from your perspective, from media, what is it that you want to see moving forward with all of the narratives that have been thrown over the past couple of weeks from the highest office to our communities?
Hold on.
You're live.
I'm having a bad echo here.
You're live. Okay, I'm gonna mute myself here.
I'm gonna mute myself. Hold on. You're live. You're live. You're live. I'm gonna mute myself. It might be on my end. You probably want to create that echo.
What I'll do is I'll throw that question over to Reverend Mercado. Reverend Mercado, your thoughts on the narratives that have been shared via social media and in our communities?
Yeah, first and foremost, obviously thoughts and prayers go out to the many families affected through these very trying times that we're experiencing as a nation. For me, I look at this in a few components and things to me that are very important. Protesting is key, right? Voices have to be heard from the Black community. That's marching on, coming together in unity. Prayer, absolutely. We got to continue to pray and prayer leaders getting together with leaders throughout this nation. But most importantly is policy changes that I want to see. Policy changes from a city and town perspective, from city council level to the state reps level, state senators, and on to the federal level as well. So collectively, there needs to be many changes. And I understand, I've spoken to a lot of my close friends that those close to me that know the closest people to me are African Americans, and just hearing some of the the pain and the things that they're going through and experiencing. And for me, it's really to continue to unite with my brothers to ensure that the voices are heard, and me as a Latino man to do what I can from my perspective to help out and be in one accord and in unity. So the things that are happening, I understand it. One thing that I want to ensure that, or I think is a conversation, is to make sure that we're also taking care of our small businesses, right? When people are out there, and I say that from the sense of when people are out there looting and things like that, we understand that some of that is going on, but it breaks my heart because I've seen some stories across the nation from small businesses that were really impacted. And when I say small businesses, I'm referring especially to those that were owned by minorities as well. So that was a little disheartening, but I understand the pain and the frustration because those closest to me have shared that with me. And again, I stand in solidarity to do what I can, throughout this community.
For you, Chief SNEED, you are yourself and Chief Riddick are in the community from the standpoint of law enforcement. For the both of you, and you guys are on opposite ends of the state, how are you feeling? What pressures are you feeling right now to make sure and ensure the safety of our communities as well as our law enforcement agents? Brother SNEED first.
Well, first I'd like to echo, thank you for having me, having us in this forum. And I'd like to echo the Reverend as far as the damage to the community. I keep hearing and reading a lot about, well, they have insurance, but you remember most of the small businesses may only have a part of their insurance. They may only cover part of the damages. Let's say my business cost me $500,000 to run or to open. My insurance that I may be able to afford may only cover 20% of that. And so we can't say, well, the insurance will cover the damages to these small businesses. They are left to suffer, and a lot of them have put their life savings in there. So I'd like to really just support what Reverend was saying on that. And as far as what we're feeling as far as pressure, you know, I can't speak for Chief Riddick, but I'm sure this part is true. As being Black and a police chief, there's extra pressure on us. There's extra expectations of us that our community, the Black community, expects us to understand what they're going through, and we do. We've grown up there. When I take off my uniform, I'm still Black. And the policing community expects us to understand what's going on there. So there's extra pressure as far as what we do and how we do it, and we need to be leading the way. We need to be the examples that the other officers and other departments are looking at, because they're looking to see what we're doing. And we have the opportunity to have a voice here. Chief Riddick will tell you, there's only, out of the 100 and some odd police departments in the state, there's only a handful of minority police chiefs and another handful of second in commands. And so we do have a role to make sure that we're doing the right thing.
For you, Chief Riddick.
Good evening. First, let me just say thank you, June, for putting this together with Dr. J, should I say. And secondly, you might see me ducking down and looking at my cell phone. I'm not being rude, but we have personnel in another town assisting with the protest. I believe Chief SNEED does also. So we're getting updates as it goes forward. Regarding the protest, I saw a meme on Facebook, and it really encapsulated what's going on. When we knelt, no one listened. When we sent in complaints, no one listened. When we had face-to-face meetings, no one listened. When we filed internal affairs complaints, nothing happened. And as they're doing and protesting and doing some damage, he said, "Do you hear me now? Are you listening now?" Now, I can't justify what's going on, nor can I condone it, but who am I to talk about someone else's pain when you just really feel that no one's listening to you, and how frustrating it is. And if you compare that to what we saw with Mr. George Floyd, no one was listening to him. The police didn't listen to him. The pain as he screamed out, no one cared, no one listened. What I mean by no one cared is regarding the officers. And then he died. So I get it. I understand. I would hope that people wouldn't do that, because it does sort of take away from the important message and mission that's going out there, and the businesses are being impacted. But I get the pain. I understand. I really, really do.
I want to shoot it over to our two brothers who are in the community, activists as well as in government, Vernon Thompson as well as Brandon McGee Jr. For you guys, and we'll start with you, Vernon. For you, how can we move forward with these protests in a fashion that best represents our community and what we are fighting for?
Okay, I'll start. My field is education. I'm currently an assistant principal. I began my career as an assistant principal at Hartford Public High School. I'm now in Bridgeport, Warren Harding High School, and Bridgeport and Hartford are two urban Black and brown cities where there's a high amount of actual violence within those cities. As a principal and as an administrator, I've had firsthand experience with students who wake up in the morning and see police officers and go home and see officers in their neighborhood. So they experience a different level of anger than even I might or we might with the incidents that occur sporadically. Like Brother Archer said, he's had 6. I'm dealing with students who deal with the police presence on a daily in their neighborhood, and it isn't pleasant. So mentally, where my mind has been at is how I feel like the cries of the people are cries to us that are in position to really make an impact. It's a question to us that what are we going to do in our position? They've taken their stance, and how do we hear it? And how I hear it is, where are our next lawyers coming from? Where are our next group of legislators who will change these situations, because it's law that needs to be changed. So from an educational standpoint, I'm looking at how we can program things. God has given me the opportunity to be over a law academy. Both high schools I've been at have had law academies. And my work going forward, I've been meeting with actual lawyers on how you can come in and how we can now aggressively recruit young Black and brown students. And even our students, we have poor Caucasian students who experience the same struggle. How can we now groom the next set of leaders? Because in the 60s, the 70s, and the 50s, that's what the job of the church was. Their main thing was, how do we groom the next set of people that will change law, because law will then change our circumstance. So I definitely relate to the anger, and I would not dare criticize it, because their experience is much more extreme than mine is at this point. And sometimes we get out of touch. One statement that Dick Gregory stated was, sometimes we get caught up in the success of a few. And when we look at our whole population, there's just a few that have been successful. If we look at successful Black cities, there's just a few that you can name. And we can't get caught up with that and criticize the pain of everyone else. But I think in our positions, what can we do now to impact and make that change? And from the educational standpoint, the plan now intensifies to create and push for that next set of leaders to look for greater opportunities, to look for colleges, to look at these students who are interested in the law and continue to groom them to change the circumstance. Because after the fighting, even when Dr. Martin Luther King marched, every march was attached to a bill or to legislation being changed. So that's where the mindset is at this point.
Representative McGee, for you, what kind of legislation can we expect moving forward? Something has to change. Where are we with legislation, or what do you see that is coming down the pike that you could share with us without letting whatever secret may be out, but just being as forthright and as transparent as you can be? What can we look forward to? What is going to help us bridge this gap?
Dr. Archer, thank you so much for this opportunity to share with you all. As you can see, I'm out on the battlefield here, where I'm at another protest, and I'm so glad that we have recipients of the 100 Men of Color on this call, this town hall, ripping off the Bandaid. And I am in the midst of so much power. And, you know, before I even get in my comments, I just want to say I'm praying for each and every one of you, especially our chief of police or chiefs of police. You all, you're carrying a lot. And then on top of that, you all are Black men. So thank you for your service. My cousin, he is on the police force, and I don't know what it's like to be a part of the force. But I do realize the impacts it's had on my life, unfortunately, in a negative sense. But as a leader, I'm able to kind of share my story on the importance of us working alongside men in blue who are serving our community. So Dr. Archer asked a very important question, and I shared this earlier with Senator Chris Murphy, talking a little bit about federal dollars and providing grants to our local police departments so that we can encourage more community policing, more purchasing of body-worn cameras, supporting Senate Bill 380 that was passed here in the state of Connecticut that basically addressed the excessive use of force. But now is the time, I believe, we have to begin recording or at least requiring proper data when many of these situations occur. I could rattle on more and more recommendations as we move along, and there's no secret. Black people are tired of what's been happening, tired of all of the inequalities that have perpetuated throughout 100 years or more, if you would. So I think what I believe, not what I think, is that the slaying or the killing of Mr. Floyd, similar to the second pandemic, and that is COVID, has shed a bright light on racism, the inequalities, the lack of resources to Black and brown communities, namely Black communities. So when you talk about tearing off the Bandaid, that Bandaid was torn off many, many years ago and patched back on with some glue and taken off again. And now you have many, many allies, many white folks who are saying, you know what, it's wrong. It's wrong. And I'm sorry, at this age, mid-age white folks are saying, wow, I've been taught to be a racist and I need to undo it. So, you know, do we have a lot of work ahead of us? Absolutely. We've got a mountain to climb. But I do believe as people of color, and again, with our white allies, our Latino brothers and sisters, we're able to break the back of racism, inequalities we ought to address, and to continue to have these types of conversation, Dr. Archer, that you're giving us to share some of the details from our respective areas as to how we can move forward. So again, thanks for allowing me this opportunity. And similar to the two chiefs of police, I'm going to turn my camera off for a second to give a few remarks, but I'll be back to the town hall.
We appreciate you, Representative McGee. I want to ask you guys, how do we, because I firmly believe that it takes two to tango, right? How do we put ourselves in a position to hold both parties accountable, right? I feel like if you run a red light and the cop pulls you over, there's accountability on both ends. You got to know that running a red light is the wrong thing to do, but also as you are pursuing someone to let them know that they've done the wrong thing, there's accountability on that end. Chief Sneed, for you, how you get people to understand.
Sorry, Dr. Archer. It's a big feedback there. Did anybody else hear the question?
Yeah, the question is, how do we make sure there's accountability from law enforcement to our young Black men and who are getting hurt?
So I don't know if somebody doesn't have their system muted or not. So if everybody can probably just check to just make sure we're all muted, that might help us put some of the echo. The accountability comes with really it starts in my office too. I have to be accountable for what my officers are doing. I see Chief Riddick shaking his head. I'm not coming through. Okay. It starts in my office. It starts up at the high ups. We have to be accountable for what our people are doing. And so I'm going to digress a little bit. I think a lot of that's going to be training. I heard an analogy about a snake. And we're all afraid of snakes because we think it's going to bite us, it's going to kill us. We're ignorant to the history of a snake. Well, the same thing happens with culture as well. If I am ignorant to another culture, I'm afraid of her. I'm apprehensive. I'm slow to respond to that culture. And so I think a lot of the things that need to be done, we have to start educating our officers as well. And one of the things that we started doing, I was just talking to Chief Riddick about this, is we've had for the last few years classes on police bias and on cultural sensitivity. We've been running those classes for the last few years. We are just getting ready to launch our program in African American history and in Latin American history and LGBTQ history. And so how do we begin to address these problems in our police department? Is we have to start educating our police departments to the community that they serve, so that we have less of these problems, that there is more of an understanding of our community that we're serving. So that comes from the chief's office. That comes from having money to do these types of training too. And so we have to have the money to do these trainings. So that's where I think that we have to begin this training. We have to educate our officers as far as immersing them in the culture of the community that they're serving. It's easy not to be sensitive or to value if I don't understand. So if the training has to come from the top. The responsibility starts at the top and it filters on its way down. We can't be blind as chief. We can't turn our heads as chief. We can't ignore what's going on as chiefs. And as black chiefs, we've heard it before. We grew up in the barbershops. We grew up in the nail shops. We grew up hearing the stories of the picnics. And so now we are in a position where we can try and make change. We're trying to do that. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, yes, you did. I want to go over to Brother Harris. Brother Harris, for you, as we're trying to bridge the gap in this accountability piece, how can we change the narrative as it is being spoken in media?
Well, we talk about change the narrative. I mean, I'm not sure what exactly you mean. I think the news media, I mean, I teach journalism. I've been a journalist, wrote a column, and still doing writing. I think the narrative that they're reporting on is what is actually happening. I think without the news media's coverage of what's going on, we wouldn't have the accountability that we are at least somewhat getting now. But I wanted to go back to something that the chief said about, I know he just kind of left there, but he mentioned something about training. And I do think training is important. But I mean, we've had, every time something like this happens, we have training, we have sensitivity things, we have all these things, and we still get what we've been getting for all these years. I think what we need is to have these officers be treated as if they are citizens, and they get the same kind of penalties that citizens who they're supposed to be protecting get. Every time you have, I mean, we're talking now about the fact of whether, even though they've been arrested, whether they're going to really get convicted. We've been here before. We saw Rodney King the first time around, and we thought with cameras, that's going to make a difference. Surely they're going to find these men guilty, all that evidence. And what happened? They were let go until they were after a second trial. So there has to be a change in the laws that make police be accountable in terms of if they commit a crime, they should be going to jail. There should not be these double standards that we currently have.
I appreciate that. I want to ask you, Riddick, is it a training issue or is it also a vetting issue?
Am I echoing? Am I coming in okay?
You're good.
Okay. Okay. I will argue that it's neither. Culture trumps policy. Culture trumps training. And until the culture is changed, you can do all the training that you want. And as Chief SNEED said, it comes from the top. You can train, and you can wink, wink, and laugh and go out and do the exact same, the opposite of what you just learned in training. Until you hold the officers accountable, starting with yourself, you're not going to see true change. And to the first part of your question, it was talking about both sides with accountability. Well, the public already starts with accountability from a kid. You know, recently we keep hearing about the talk that we all, probably all of us on this link, this webcast have had. Well, the talk started back in the slave days. The talk started with don't look massa in the eye. The talk started with don't look at massa's wife or children. And as you go forward in history, the talk goes, if you walk down the road and there's a white woman, don't look at her if you're a black male. And then eventually it led to the motor vehicle stops and the like. So the public has been educated. African Americans have been educated. We have to educate our police officers. And Chief SNEED said that he has started a program educating his officers. And when I was a chief in Waterbury, and I've continued this in West Hartford, while not a formal program, I've been educating our officers on the history of law enforcement, which started over in Europe, which people don't really understand, for separatism, to keep classes away from each other. We took that model to the United States in the late 1600s, 1700s, where they were guarding property. And as we know, what was slaves? What were African Americans back then? Blacks. We were property. So you had the slave patrols and the like, going all the way up to segregation. And the vehicle that was used, the mechanism that was used to enforce segregation, to enforce slavery in different forms, was law enforcement, up to and including today. I was born in 1966, and during 1966, there were still issues that were happening. My father, my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, they can tell me stories within my lifetime, so it's not that long ago. So when we have these difficult conversations, when we educate our officers as to why, especially black males, feel some type of way during a motor vehicle stop and may be nervous, not because they have drugs, they're nervous because they want to live, because of the stories they've heard and the things they've seen, that's when true change starts.
Do you feel like there is a lack of value? We had a question online here that how can we encourage our officers to value the communities that they serve? Is it self-policing, or is it just making sure, like you said, just across the board, coming from the top, that they understand that they have to be invested in our communities to make sure that these communities not only are law-abiding, but just they feel good. Like you feel good when you have your law enforcement coming to these communities. Because I remember growing up where you weren't fearing an officer when he came up. It was, hey, Officer SNEED, hey, Officer Riddick, like, how you doing? How are you doing? How are your parents doing? How's school? There was a conversation that was had. There was a trust. There was a level of trust. And I feel like we've gotten so far away from that. So to that person's question, like, how do we encourage our officers to have value in the communities that they serve?
So to the example that you gave, if you go back in time, a lot of the officers, especially minority officers, one, you didn't have a lot of us. So when you did, you had a black officer in a black neighborhood walking a beat. So you had, quote unquote, officer friendly because you knew him, and more than likely he lived a couple houses down from you. That has changed over the years. You talk about, accountability and valuing the neighborhood. Well, here's where it's difficult, and I hope, and Chief SNEED, with your experience in Middletown and your other places, I hope you can jump in too, is as a leader in law enforcement, whether it's a sergeant, lieutenant, a captain, chief, deputy chief, you have to be cognitive. As the young folks said, you have to be woke. If you're in a particular neighborhood, like a high drug area, and that's all you deal with is African-American males or Hispanic males, pants hanging down, dressing a certain type of way, and these are people you're getting drugs off of, and you're in that area a lot, after a while, you start to believe that's how, quote unquote, they all must be. We have to recognize that, talk about that, and educate our officers that no, this is just a small segment of that. But it takes courage, it takes time, and it takes, quote unquote, wokenness to be able to do that. So you have to teach. This is too funny. Thank you, Lord. You said value. They haven't valued us for 400 years. So if we think that that's going to happen overnight, it's not. We have to continue to do our part as citizens and continue to have bold statements like we're having tonight in discussions to make change. And I'll end with this. The other part of this is, you know, when we have our Caucasian colleagues and our counterparts, when they rip off the Band-Aid and they acknowledge some of their biases, we can't tear them down and rip them apart. That's what we want. Now is the chance for dialogue. Now is a chance for education. Because otherwise, as soon as you start pointing fingers and say, oh, you racist, you this, they're going to shut down. And now we can't have that conversation. And now it's behind closed doors and we can't address it.
Thank you for making this for 400 years. I want to send this back over to Brother Harris, who has been very adamant about the celebration of the first person to come over here in 400 years. And we've been still fighting these same fights. How should we celebrate, Brother Harris? How should we be celebrating? Because it seems as though this is the 400th year and we are celebrating this in a fashion that is uncomfortable, that is uncharacteristic of what we should be doing. 400 years of slavery since the first slave was here. How should we be celebrating it? It shouldn't be this way.
Well, it's actually the 401st now. And I don't really say celebrate. I say commemorate the first enslaved African who was brought to America. And, you know, it's ironic that after this 401st year now will become August, that we are still dealing with the same things that in many ways our ancestors were dealing with, that our parents are dealing with. I think, I mean, you know, to kind of go back to the point that was made before about educating our children, you know, as it was said, it's always been done. This has been a very challenging time for me personally, and I'm sure for everyone on this panel and throughout America, because for me, I'm 63 years old. My dad just passed away recently at the age of 90. Grew up in Mississippi. And one of the things that he recalls was this Black man, a Spanish-American war veteran, beaten to death by this officer, this cop. And nothing happened to that man. And he didn't have his knee on the guy's neck, but he beat the man to death. We've had people come from wars, lynched in their uniforms. And, you know, I'm trying to stay on topic here, but it's just one of the things that has been said on the memorial today and what people have been saying, have been asked, are we turning a corner? You know, is this event, the watershed event that's going to change things? And the thing that goes to my mind was, we thought that with the Emancipation Proclamation. We thought that with Reconstruction. We thought when World War I, when we went and served overseas, that America would say that we are Americans too. We thought that when we got the Civil Rights Movement, and we thought that when we got our first Black president. I had students telling me, my generation, you know, their generation is not like their parents' generation. This was 20 years ago. Well, here we are. I don't want to sound negative because I'm basically a positive person, but I'm also a realistic person. And I think it's important that we stay on this, that we keep our, you know, that we keep our hearts and our minds into trying to make this a better place for everyone. I do think that indeed, when we have more white people supporting this than we have had in the past, there's a groundswell all around the world. So things are different in that particular case. And I do think we need to encourage that. I've had whites a white teacher, one of my daughter's teachers, called last week to say he's standing with us. And those things are important. They make a difference because it lets us know that we're not alone and that every person out there is not against us. you know, I probably digress from the question.
Oh no, I appreciate it. Reverend Mercado, I want you to chime in on this. I'm a very spiritual person. I go to church when I have the opportunity to. What can you say to those who, at this point, are saying, "I am tired of praying. I'm tired of going to church and trying to change." You know, the perspective of those. Like, I keep praying to God. I keep praying to Allah. I keep praying to whatever higher being. Like, what can you say to those persons who are watching and listening today to give them the encouragement that they need?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and it ties in a little bit to what I said earlier, but absolutely, first and foremost, is say, hey, don't lose hope. Number one, from a spiritual standpoint, continue, you know, to pray, right? Like you said, to the God that you pray, continue to seek Him daily. I do believe in the power of prayer. I do believe that prayer changes things, and miracles will happen, and walls will break down. And you know, you give a preacher a mic, you go on and on. But I do believe in that faith perspective that mountains will move. But aside from that, right, it's more than just prayer. It's spiritual leaders coming together, joining hands, you know, like back in the civil rights movement, right? Just coming together and really helping to lead the charge to help bring change, getting together with our community members, getting together with our political leaders, because the conversations are great. The prayer is, to me, is probably one of the most, if not the most important thing for guidance, wisdom, and discernment. However, as spiritual leaders, we also need to step up and do more, I think, during these trying times. And we got to join forces. We got to pray for our elected officials, and be a voice, that is in that room. Because, you know, keep in mind, there are many pastors that have big congregations that have many members that attend your church. So when you have many pastors and many individuals that come together, and you see the churches and their members joining forces, a great impact can be made. So to me, continue to pray, continue to keep the faith, but then let's unite together, because to me, prayer and faith is the foundation of all things. You know, faith, you know, without action is dead as well. So we need to come together with our leaders, but don't lose hope. But there has to be action also from my part.
Vernon, we have a question here that has come from YouTube, and I think it's a great question. And this, you know, Chiefs, if you could chime in on this, I think it'd be great. But I want to shoot it to Vernon, because you are in the educational system. You are with our young men and women of color who are the future leaders of our future. How do we educate them and give them the best examples that, you know, the question is, even if the constituents they are serving are selling drugs, talking back, wearing their pants low, you know, defacing property, how do we demonstrate that they have value?
So, and I mean, this is my experience, so I'm not speaking from a hypothetical perspective. I've seen it, and I've gone back and forth with African American brown students who are just like this, and you have to keep speaking the truth to power. You have to be consistent, and you can't give up. And some will make mistakes, but the hope is that you leave some truth that they can hold on to. You don't stop delivering the truth. You don't stop telling them what life is about and what the right decisions are because of their mistakes. And sometimes, you know, just from my perspective, I've been in education for 15 years. You feel like you're beating a dead horse, but I've seen students later. I've seen students who I didn't think I was getting through to tell me, like, look, you never stopped. You were relentless, and now they're working a job. And you know the reality, and it's just like my brother was saying. You have to be real about it. Everybody doesn't get saved, but you have to believe that you can. It's not easy, but you have to continue to give students some truth that they can stand on. I do believe that every student does see the light. There's some that just make mistakes that are too deep to kind of come out of it. But we have to give them something to stand on. You have to give them some truth, and you can't give up regardless of the external circumstances that students face. It's not an easy job, but one of my favorite quotes from educator Dr. Emdeed, what he said is, you may want to sleep and you may not want to wake up, but I'm going to make sleep uncomfortable. So my thing is, I'm not going to let you comfortably sleep on a mattress with a comforter over you. I got to make that sleep uncomfortable. Some will wake up, but some will sleep. But I'm not going to make that sleep comfortable while you're around me. And that's what we can do. We will save some. And these streets, just from what I've experienced, these streets are deep and they have a stronghold on a lot of students. And it's not the majority, though, from what I've experienced in some of the toughest urban high schools. The data backs it in terms of where I've been. The majority is not tied in deep. It is a minority, but some can be saved. We just can't let sleep be a comfortable position for students.
In 1989, NWA released a song about police brutality. It seems as though we're still having this conversation in 2020. I just want to, I know the answer to the question. I'm being facetious. I'm playing devil's advocate, but how can we change the perception? Because how can you be perceived as a threat because of the color of your skin? For me, I feel like that should now be on a back burner. We are talking about right versus wrong, not black versus white, brown and black. Where can we find the opportunity? And I think, Brother Harris, this might be a question for you. How do we, as media people, it seems as though sometimes media sensationalizes things. So now this thing now has been, oh, I can't breathe again. I can't breathe again. Another one shot again. It seems as though media, when I was talking about the narrative earlier, we're sensationalizing these things that for some people, Sandra Bland, Sean Bell, and the list goes on and on. It was been sensationalized to the point where it's just another black or brown body dead. This one feels different, though. This one feels really different. The protesting feels different. I can't remember a time where we protested for 10 days straight. Someone would have to educate me on it, but it feels different. I was protesting just this past Monday, and I told somebody in the crowd, this feels different. How can we begin to educate people from a media standpoint instead of sensationalizing things, where now we've gotten to the point where it's just another one, like it's been happening. It's been happening for 400 years. It's been happening since Rodney King. It's been happening since, et cetera. It's like in 2020, how can we do better to educate? Now that our friends who are not people of color saying, well, what can we do? What can we learn? How can we help? From a media standpoint, how can we educate them?
I think first you have to distinguish between social media and the news media. The reason why we're aware of all these different incidents, tragedies, and murders is because everybody's got a camera, a phone. So you're seeing, this is not the news media, this is the public. The news media picks up on it and so forth. Now, yes, the news media sensationalizes things because there are sensational things going on. I'm not saying that things should not, these things should not be covered all the time, but you got an event like this, of course it's going to get attention. And the reality is that if you got people walking peacefully and you got somebody else throwing a stone through a window, guess what's going to get more attention? That doesn't, and the same with the beatings and the tear gassing and everything else that's going on. One of the things that I also want to say is that, when I'm teaching journalism students, I'm teaching them to go out and report what they see. I'm teaching them to go out and interview people from the different sides. And, I'm not trying to be like Trump because I don't agree with, what he was saying about them being equitable in terms of the Virginia March. But a journalist is supposed to cover all sides of a news event. That means the pros and the cons, the good, the bad, the ugly, and the evil, and everything else. So, you know, in terms of what I think the public needs to know is to distinguish between, you know, social media and the news media. The news media is supposed to go out and report and also distinguish between these talk shows, which are really not news shows. They are opinion shows where people are talking about their opinions and so forth. So, I mean, that's the main thing that the point that I would want to make with regards to this. But if I could add something else, though.
Please do.
Responsibility. Okay, we're talking about responsibility of police. We're talking about responsibility of education, of journalists, and so forth, religion, and so forth. But let me ask a question to you, everybody on this panel, and everybody else who's listening. Suppose you were observing this officer on this guy's neck. What would you do? Because that disturbed me, not just the knee on that officer's, on his neck, George Floyd's neck, but the fact that people took out their camera and did nothing. I mean, I wrote a column 5 years ago for the Current, and one of the points that I said is too many people think their only responsibility is to take pictures and record it. If you choking me to death, don't sit there and just tell the guy to get off me. If he's not going to get off me, please get that man off my neck. Don't let that person take my life, because you can do all these marches and demonstrations. It ain't going to bring me back. And that's the thing that stuff goes back to slavery, where we watched people get lynched and beaten and killed and did nothing. Now, I was talking with my older daughter about this. And she said, well, if you do that, the police officer is going to shoot you. That you put yourself in danger. And I know that. But what if that's your child out there? What if that's your parent, your grandparent, your daughter, your son? Are we going to just stand there and let that happen? I know officers, chiefs. What I'm saying here, it may not be nice, but I'm saying if we got to distract those officers to get them off that person's neck, then that's what we need to do. I could not in good conscience just stand there and record and watch somebody and not be haunted for the rest of my doggone life. So I think we have to take individual responsibility. If these people were not wearing uniforms, would we be allowing this to happen? It's murder. You don't let a murderer just commit a murder in front of you without at least trying to stop it. That's my thoughts on that.
Do we, Chief Riddick, Chief SNEED, do we add fuel to the fire? What is the procedure in this case? I think, Brother Harris, you make a good point, right? If we were on the playground and someone's getting beat up, at some point, people are going to jump in and we're going to try to break it up. Obviously, we have to respect law enforcement. That's why accountability is key here. However, what is the procedure? Because we've seen it and we're seeing it now. Like somebody wants to get involved, someone's recording, and then you hear an officer say, put your phone down, stop recording, disperse. What is the proper way? Please educate those who are listening and watching on how we can do something without getting hurt in the process of making sure that someone doesn't get hurt.
Okay. I'll start, I guess. Professor Harris, I hear you 100%. And at the end of the day, I can't argue with the fact that if someone is about to lose their life, do you just stand there and watch that person lose your life? But I pose the question back to you. The reality of it is, and I'm embarrassed to say this, but the reality is if that person comes at that police officer, he's already shown a non-deference to life, doesn't care. He's probably going to pull out his firearm and shoot that person. So the question really is, are you willing to sacrifice your life for someone that you don't know? That's a tough one when it's law enforcement. And secondly, that happens. They hit the emergency button on their radio, and now the cavalry's coming. And I'm just going to keep it real because we said we're pulling the Band-Aid off. The cavalry's going to come. They're not going to be asking questions how this started. They're going to immediately go to the defense of the police officer. That's the training. That's what goes on. So you say, Chief Riddick, Chief SNEED, what do I do? Well, I think the videotaping was a good way to do it. But for the videotape, we wouldn't have these things. But secondly, call. I know it's going to sound convoluted and counterintuitive. Call 911 and say there's an officer that is choking someone. And they're dying. Get a supervisor here immediately. And more than likely, in Chief SNEED, somebody will get on and at least find out what's going on. And that might have simulated that tap, 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 that tap out that we're talking about. If you get a supervisor call in and find out what's going on there. And my last point is, and Professor Harris, I hear you, I do. We have to be careful because this was quote unquote the easy one to say, hey, you should have intervened. But unfortunately, there's other ones when it's not so clear. Use of force is not pretty, it's ugly, and we might be having people jumping in the middle of things that they shouldn't be, and it's wrong. So I hope I provided some solutions. It's probably not 100%. I hear you, and I couldn't have faulted someone in that crowd if they would have dove on that officer. But at the very least, it probably would have saved George Floyd's life.
I want to, Chief SNEED, I want to thank you for that, Chief Riddick. Chief SNEED, I want to tap into what happened at Central Park with the young lady who called the cops on the black man because of the situation with the dog. Can we, because I believe this is something that happens with domestic disputes, everybody goes to the police station. Like everybody, we're going to take everybody down to the police station. We're going to figure this out. Is there a way that we can do that so we can figure out exactly what happened instead of saying, okay, she made the complaint to you, you're going down, and we don't know what's going to happen to that person, right? Because there's two sides to the story, but it feels as though if you bring them both down and you're dealing with a false situation, a false claim, and somebody's profiling, how can we go about making sure that the right result happens?
We're lucky in that particular case where that brother filmed everything. Often that's not the case. It's one person's word against another person's word, and this one was filmed from the beginning. So we were blessed with that. And so how do we stop that from happening? Unfortunately, I can't tell you how to stop that from happening. That racism, that hatred is inbred in her and other people, and that's going to unfortunately continue to haunt us for God knows how long. We've already talked about the 400 years, centuries that we've already dealt with this. It's going to continue. But in this particular case, we were lucky enough that there was a video, and we're lucky enough that the officers did do a thorough job. And that's what we need to do, make sure that the officers are doing their job when they're out there. And that's, again, Chief Riddick's job, my job, and the other chiefs of police job to make sure that our officers are being sensitive, are being thorough in their investigation, and being complete in their investigations, and taking the time to listen to both sides and do their due diligence as far as enforcing the law. And if I can for a second too, someone asked about how do we get officers to value their, I think a YouTube question that was, how do we get officers to value their the areas that they patrol? Often in my 35 years of policing, when I hear the terminology, we do community policing in our agency. We do community policing in our agency. What I've often found, and again, not everywhere, that community policing in the minds of those leaders means that they go to the meetings, the chiefs, the deputy chiefs, and the captains. But who patrols the neighborhood are the officers. We're the officers at that meeting. We're the officers at those gatherings. We're the officers at the Boys and Girls Club, at the cookout, or whatever it is that's going on in the community. Those are the officers that are responding to the calls for service, not the chief of police. I can send out edicts all I want, but my officers are the ones that are responding. They have to become sensitive to the environment. They need to go to the events. That's community policing. It has to be, the department has to be immersed in it. The department has to believe in it, and the department has to take part in it. That's how we begin to have officers value their community that they serve. And again, education. I still believe in the education. Mr. Harris, I know I hear you and I agree with you. But what you said about we've done this, We have to drill it in all the time. We can't just send a person to training one time because they were bad. We have to reinforce it. We have to repeat this training on a regular basis, on an ongoing basis, so that we can begin to change the culture inside the departments. And that's not going to happen if we don't begin somewhere. And part of that somewhere is educating us. And part of the somewhere is also making sure that our officers are going to these calls for services and being sensitive. And part of that, learning how to be sensitive, is making sure that you're being immersed in the community that you serve. Go to the meetings, go to the cookouts, go to whatever's going on in the neighborhood, and be seen. Vernon talked about, Chief Riddick talked about how it used to be, I got assigned to the housing projects. That's how I was. I know Vernon did too. We walked around, we sat on the porch, we did those types of things, and that's what we're missing now. We're starting to see it come back around. You see it on social media every once in a while, but that's what we have to get back to. That's how you get people to value the community that they serve. They have to care. I hope I answered your question.
No, you most certainly did. I want to touch on one other piece, and this is definitely for the Chiefs. And this is something that bothered me. I watched the movie The Hate You Give last year, and I watched it with my children. And in there's a scene where the young girl who witnessed the murder, who was in the car with her friend, speaks to her uncle, who is in law enforcement. And she asks him blatantly, if that was a black kid, would you have done the same thing? He said, if I felt like he was brandishing a weapon, yes. She said, so if it was a white kid, would you have done the same thing? And he said, no. And she asked him almost matter-of-factly, why? And he couldn't answer that. Is there a reason why we apprehend whites and we use brute force with blacks? Is this systemic? Is this fear? What is that? For those who are listening, watching, who have these questions, what is that, and why is that? And can we change that? Chief Riddick, I'll throw that to you first. And anybody can chime in as they see fit.
I remember that scene vividly. I watched it with my family, and I thought it was real, to be honest with you. And that goes back to, if you remember what I said before, when you work in certain neighborhoods, and after a while you start seeing people in a certain light, and you have to guard against that. So what Common was actually saying was, over the years, that's how you start to view blacks when they have a weapon or brandishing a weapon as a threat. That's the reality of it. But if it comes to a white male in a similar situation, you're not perceived as a threat. Some of it is through the media. Some of it's through perception and prejudice and the like. And since we're pulling a Band-Aid off, some of the responsibility is on us as African Americans, how we conduct ourselves. As the professor had said, responsibility. The degradation of our society, what we see on TV now, used to be on HBO when we were growing up. Now they're actually having sex and blowing off heads on regular TV at 7 o'clock. And we wonder why our kids are going crazy. We have our parents, the parents of these kids, where when we were younger, we went to church, whether we wanted to or not. We have a whole lost generation who doesn't go to church or anything else. So it's the view, and it's hard to say just law enforcement. It's just how, all right, thank you, Lord. Dr. Archer, you had mentioned how a police officer could say that. I'm going to keep it real. If you or Professor Harris, Mr. Mercado, maybe not Vernon because he got the V, so I'm going to give him a pass. But you're walking down the street, and you have 3 young black males with hoodies pulled over their head. And on the other side of the street, you have 3 white males with hoodies over their head, dressed identically. Which one are you going to fear? And you have to pick a side. Middle is not an option. Where are you going to go? And I've posed this during community meetings, and I've heard African Americans say that they would go to the white side because they'd be more afraid of their own people. I'm just keeping it real.
I mean, I'm not going to argue with that. Is that systemic for us, though? Is that what that is?
Well, I'm going to actually go. So I agree with Chief. The media has a large role in this. Media does, it has so much power over what we think and what we do, and how have we been portrayed. And so the media has the power of, if we watch it and watch it enough, we begin to believe what we see on television, the TV shows, the commercials, the music that we listen to. And as we listen to these things, as we watch these things, that's how we are portrayed. We've been portrayed as pimps. We've been portrayed as Aunt Jemimas. We've been portrayed certain ways throughout history. And we begin to believe what we see. The reality is, or the perception becomes reality. And so how do we portray bad guys on television? Their pants are hanging down, they got hoodies on, and we begin to see that on a regular basis, and that's how we begin to respond to it. We become, media actually begins to prime our thought process. And so when it's time to deal with them, that's what we believe. So now, I use an analogy when I'm talking to young people, right, about the police officer pulling them over. That police officer has listened to Snoop and everybody, 5-0 and the drug dealing and everything else, and all the negative stuff in the rap music, because now white people listen to rap music just like we do. They've seen this stuff growing up on television. They've been primed to think this way. On the opposite end, I have a black child who's grown up going to the house, going to the barber shop, going to the family picnics, and hearing the negative stories about police brutality. When that car stop happens years down the road, that white cop who grew up this way, the black person who grew up hearing all the negative stories, as soon as the white cop gets out the car, or the cop gets out the car and he sees the black person over there, he begins to prime his mind. That's, oh shit, here we go. Excuse me. Oh shoot, here we go. The person in the car begins to say, oh crap, here we go. Just like I've always heard. And so the bridge begins to build right then. The person in the car has a negative connotation of the police officer. The police officer has a negative connotation of the person in the car. And right off the bat, you've begun, it's going to go bad. And that's what we're starting to see. We've been primed to look at minorities in a certain different way because of what we are primed to see on television, how the media has begun to prime our mind and our mindsets, the songs that we hear, the things that we see. It's just... And we don't see white America portrayed in those types of manners. And so, yes, unfortunately, there is that to deal with, our own prejudice, our own biases that we have to acknowledge and that we have to deal with.
How do we, Brother Harris, because you are not only a mentor, but a hero of mine, just as Lou Brown is a hero and a mentor to me. And you guys have been on the front lines trying to speak our truth. And I know there have been days, I know that Brother Lou Brown has shared with me that his hands were tied at times when you are in the hood and you're trying to tell the story from a different perspective and a different angle so that the narrative doesn't come back to bite you, but your hands are tied. How do we support you in telling our stories so that, I mean, your voice is heard? We love what you're doing. We love the stories you tell about us. But is there a way that we could tell our young people, listen, help us make the narrative better. Help us make the stories a prettier story. Everything's not going to be pretty. I get it. Every day is not going to be a rosy day. You may get stopped by the cops. You may get harassed. But how can we educate them on helping you tell our story in a better light?
Well, I mean, I think Chief Sneed, you provided a very good picture of how cultures clash because everybody has a perception of other people and whether we're the other people or they're the other people. It's a very good analogy of what happens when cultures come together and they have perceptions. I think with regards to, journalists and telling a story, which is, well, again, media includes television, movies, music. That's different from news media. You know, that's not to say that news media doesn't shape perceptions. The news media has been a very big part of passing on the racist narrative for years. The caricatures and all the other things have been taking place for years. I do agree with what Chief Riddick said about, you know, we have to take responsibility for some of this in terms of how we conduct ourselves. You know, I could go into a whole thing about the N-word, but I'm not going to do that. I think it's disrespectful for us to be calling each other that and making music, but you know, what do I know? I'm just an older guy, you know. But I think that in terms of telling the story, I think we really need to have parents who are going to hold their children accountable and hold themselves accountable. I do think we have to instill that respect and self-respect for our children. That goes with regards to teaching. Mr. Thompson, in terms of what you were saying about not giving up on your students. And one of the things that I've learned is you never know what words you're going to say that's going to have a positive impact on someone. You know, I've had students tell me things, come back and tell me what this meant to them, as you were saying, and I had no idea so I think it's impossible. We really need to instill in our children a pride in who they are and who we are. But I think we also need to instill this thing of respect for other people, no matter who they are, and to treat people the way you want to be treated. You want to talk about the golden rule, Rev Mercado, I mean, that would apply to that. So I think in terms of changing the narrative, we have to take responsibility for ourselves. But at the same time, you know, over the years, regardless of what we've done, we're still subject to the realities that other people are going to perceive us a certain way, no matter what we do. You know, so that's the best way that I can answer that.
Reverend Mercado, I want to ask you this respectfully. This is not just a Black thing; it's a Black and brown thing. And I want to ask you, how can we help people from a humanistic standpoint? Black, brown, Asian, we are all being discriminated against. It is our fight. It just happens to be that in the forefront, we see a lot of Black bodies that are taking the brunt of this disrespect. For you, as a Latino brother, how can we bridge that gap in getting us all together as people of color? Not saying, you know, well, you know, I'm a West Indian background. That's my culture, but I'm born here. So I am a Black American. However, that doesn't mean much if we are all lumped in together. You guys are people of color. How do we come together spiritually as well to stand up for each other? Because sometimes I feel like, and I could be wrong, you guys could chime in, that, well, that's not my fight because, you know, they don't bother the Puerto Ricans over here. They don't bother the Chinese over here. You know, the Dominicans, we're good. There's dark and there's light Dominicans, but they don't really bother us. But y'all Black people, y'all getting it. Y'all getting it real good over there. What can we do to have some kind of solidarity? Yeah,
you know, and that's a great question. I've actually had that conversation with some brothers as well, and unfortunately, there's what some ministers call church politics, and the reality is, you know, you have different groups, and you have the Latinos over here, right? Some Blacks over here, some whites over here, and I've had those conversations with some Black pastors that are great friends of mine and very close, and is how do we come together to bring holistic change, but starting with the spiritual sense is how do we unite as churches so that, you know, the Latino church and the Black church could see that, hey, we're here to work together. We're here to bring change, and then get our communities working. A lot of times from what I've seen personally as a community leader, I've seen different silos, whether it's Latinos, whites, Asians, whatever race, right? And it's good, but I think holistically, I understand that there's always going to be different agendas, right, from different races or whatnot. But how do we come together for that, to impact change for a main agenda? The Latinos, the Blacks, other minorities come together, and I think that's needed, especially for. And I keep going back to policy because I understand the conversation between, you know, the police brutality throughout the country and things that we have to change, because there has to be changes within police departments and the chiefs. I mean, you guys hit it well today, but at the same time, I think that we have to come together to bring changes at the state capitol throughout the country. So it is important for us to come together. And it's going to start with conversations, some uncomfortable conversations within leaders of the faith communities, really getting together and talking about what impacts our communities separately, but then also how do we come together to bring change together. So my view on it is, as spiritual leaders, we have to start having tough conversations behind closed doors, and then begin to funnel ways to really come together and then lead that change collectively.
Vernon, I want to ask you this. I want to start with you. Do we need to start sharing our stories with our counterparts to let them know that we've been affected by this on a personal level? Because we can look at you as vice principal of your institution, and you're well dressed, you're well put together, and there's no way Vernon Thompson Jr. has ever been harassed. There's no way he's ever been identified as something else other than what he is. There's no way brute force wasn't brought upon him because of the color of his skin. Do we need to start sharing our stories?
It's essential, and it's very necessary. And just to give just a context of how children and students will respond positively, knowing that you share their experience, that you had a little experience, and you're disconnected. And for me, growing up in the hip hop generation and prior, in my early years as a teacher, I was also still a hip hop artist. So that kind of kept me connected, and students felt very, very connected to me very early on, where I felt like I was hearing too much. Just very transparent, but I had good mentors at the time. I had brother Kevin Muhammad, who I would talk to about this, former officer Dave Daniels, and they were saying, look, this is good stuff and this is a trust that you have. But I would hear students tell me, look, I got this and this gun and we have this and this problem. And they definitely need to hear the stories to understand, you really understand where they're coming from, because that's the only way to kind of tear down some of these walls. And the walls are very serious. And sometimes if they don't understand your story, if you don't have a story that connects, and if your story doesn't connect, they need to understand that you understand what they're going through, because it is very serious. I've been in Hartford, I've been in Bridgeport, and these students on the north and south end of Hartford and the north, south, east, and west end of Bridgeport are experiencing some very extreme things within the home and within these streets. And school is a therapeutic thing. It's a chance to get away from that. And our first role when they step in is almost that of a therapist. So you have to share your stories, and you have to break a wall where there is true trust to really help students who are coming from these backgrounds. And this is, as Brother Harris said, it's very difficult, and we have to be realistic. And one of the challenges that I've had to face in this year is, if you work with one student and you get him to put a weapon down, the thing is, they're afraid of that stereotype. They're seeing that they're hearing from the Chicago hip hop that the other student still has his gun. So it is a very serious challenge, but your story has to be shared in order for someone else to share their story with you. So it's very necessary that our stories get shared, because there can easily be a disconnect. And if we're not awake, we can be very disconnected. And one thing that I've had to do, even on my personal end, just being, in a different situation than a lot of the students I teach, my feelings may not be the same, but I have to sit back and be a sponge to what's being expressed in those streets. And I have to put myself in those shoes. So stories are very much necessary to bridge a necessary gap to change things for our students, for the youth, and even the adults in our community. I've been blessed to be in Bridgeport. My father pastored on the east end of Bridgeport where I currently teach. So people kind of know my story, and knowing that story does a lot to assist parents and to assist students. So it's very necessary, and it's a great point that you're making. Our stories have to be shared.
As we get ready to wind down, I want to make sure we make time for everyone. But Chief SNEED, I want to start with you first. Where do we go from here? And I want you to talk from your perspective of law enforcement. Where do we go from here? We learned today that all 4 officers were in court as they memorialized George Floyd, and we went from I think it's now 2nd-degree murder, right? That's great. The protesting, I believe, is going to continue. But where do we go from here from a law enforcement perspective?
Got to hit that mute button, I guess, right? This is an opportunity for us to grow. It's a tragedy, and I spoke on this, initially. You probably saw it on my Facebook. As soon as this happened, I posted the answer. It's a tragedy. It can never be explained. There is no excuse for it. COVID has allowed, if this is my opinion, the fact that we've had COVID has allowed this to take the roots that it has now, to take the step off the way that it has now. Otherwise, white America would be, and black America would be at work now. And so the 9 to 5s, and they would not have the time to sit back and go out and protest. So God, whatever you believe, made this happen. So we now have an avenue to take this and move it forward. Where do we go? We have to stay on top of this. We cannot let this fall off. We have to stay active in this. We have to make sure that there are changes. I know that Chief Riddick and myself and a lot of other chiefs, and not just black chiefs, all the chiefs are making, especially in Connecticut, are doing things to try and make this better, to try and make our departments better. But we have to stay on track here, and we have to have the community still say, this is what we expect. They have to hold us accountable. And we have to do a better job. And that's plain and simple. We as a policing agency have to do a better job. We have to do a better job of keeping track of ourselves. We have to stay on top of our officers. That's where we go from here. And again, like I said, we have to do, to educate our officers as well. And it can't just be a class. It has to be ongoing. We have, if I want to try to combat the negative stuff that they've learned, I have to make sure that I drown them in all of the history of Latin American, African American, LGBTQ community. I have to give them as much coming in as they had, or while they're here, as they had before they came in. So this is an opportunity for us to change how we police and how we educate our officers and move forward from there.
Brother Harris, where do we go from here? As people, social media, print, advertising, where do we go from here?
I think a couple of things. Background noise here. I think a few things. I think we need to, as I said before, change the laws so that police officers they're not so easily able to duck under cover of what they're able to do now. I think we need to vote in November to get Trump out of office, because I think he's responsible for a lot of the sentiment that gives people the encouragement to feel that they can do just about whatever they want to do. I think we need to protest, but be safe, because I am really concerned that, we got everybody wearing these masks and stuff, but all that contact and everything, I'm just concerned about the safety of the protesters and everyone else who's out there. Lastly, I think, what the chief was saying about building sensitivity and what have you. I almost think we need to have an exchange program. Like you used to have exchange students. go to other countries and learn their cultures. Maybe we need to send these officers to some black homes and live there for, I'm being a little facetious here, but exchange, have them exchange and eat our cooking and experience our culture that kind of way. Maybe they'll come out and they'll be stone soul brothers and sisters. I don't know. I'm being half facetious here, but I think we need to keep on keeping on and understand that nothing's going to be given to us. And lastly, we have to be concerned about our democracy, because if we don't have the democracy, as things aren't perfect as they are with the democracy in terms of our liberties and the things that we have with regards to other Americans, but if we don't have a democracy, things will be much worse for us and everybody. So I think we really need to get out and vote and be willing to fight for our democracy.
Chief Riddick, where do we go from here? In your opinion?
Quickly, one, we have to address the unions. I think somebody has to mute their microphone. We have to address the unions. When we have these situations, the unions always come out strong on behalf of the officer. I believe the FOP in Minnesota might have come out and said something, but we have to start there. And once the unions start understanding it, then we know we've changed some culture. Number two, the arbitration process. As Chief SNEED knows, there's times as a chief that you will discipline someone, even terminate them. And you get to the arbitration panel, you go through the due process, and then they overturn your decision. And three, we have to really change the culture of the minority, black and brown, Hispanic community to become police officers. We have to do that. I've been trying to recruit in West Hartford, and when I was in chief in Waterbury, and people don't want to become police officers. The West Hartford Police Department starts off at $68,000 with this old, hey wife, I'm on TV, thank you. A lot of background noise, sorry. At $68,000, and we top out at about $91,000 for a patrol officer with no overtime. And I still can't get minorities to apply, and you have a black chief. So if the community can help us address those issues, I think it can go a long way for change. Thank you.
I appreciate that. I really appreciate you. Chief, I'm going to let you go. I'm going to bring in Brandon McGee. I want to thank you so much for your time and sharing your thoughts and opinions on this. Please be safe out there. Keep doing what you're doing. And people are talking about doing a part 2. So we're going to make sure that we have you back on this platform. So I want to thank you so much for just your time, your service, and all that you've been doing for our communities. I thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're good.
I'm going to bring in State Representative Brandon McGee. He is out at a rally right now. Representative McGee, where do we go from here? The election is coming up. What can we do as American citizens to ensure that we are going in the right direction?
Dr. Archer and everybody else on this call, you brothers have educated me a lot tonight, from law enforcement to the very intellectual Frank Harris, and to faith and education. Thank you. Thank you so much. You know, where do we go from here? We have to continue the protests. We have to continue speaking our truth to power. We also have to understand the importance of voting. Nothing will change just protesting and yelling and screaming about what we know and what we've experienced. But if you don't couple that energy, that same passion, and advocating for laws to be changed, and if you don't vote, nothing is going to happen. So as a person who's served about 4 terms in the Connecticut State Legislature, I understand the importance of voting, and I know each and every one of you on this this Zoom or StreamYard understand the importance of it as well. And so if I could encourage any of our millennials, any of my older folk who just have given up on the system because they've seen so many years of inequalities. They haven't seen changes. I say now is the time that you register to vote, that you register your grandchildren 18 and over. You tell people in school or on social media, now is the time to show your power, and that is by voting. You know, I could remember reading in my textbooks all what took place during the 60s and 70s and how my foreparents and fathers fought and literally died for us to have a right to vote. So we stand on some very strong shoulders. And whether you're Black, Puerto Rican, or you're white, it is important for us to understand that voting is important, but also voting for those who have your interest in mind, and voting for the Black people who have been suppressed for so many years. Now is the time to do so. So again, Dr. Archer, thank you so much, not only being this great person, but also being my mentor, a person who I've met when I was probably about 13 years old. So I'm not going to tell the folks how old you are, but it's been some time, and I really appreciate the ground that you've laid for me to walk and to do the things that I do. Peace and power, brothers.
Listen, thank you, gentlemen, so much for your time. For those who are listening and watching on YouTube and on Facebook, thank you so much for joining us here for Time to Rip Off the Band-Aid. We will continue these discussions. We will continue the dialogue. We will continue to protest without destruction. Let us be proud when we walk away from this moment that change will be the change that we want to see, but you have to be the change that you want to see. So from myself, 1128 Entertainment, and all the gentlemen, honorees, past and present from the 100 Men of Color Black Tie Gala Awards, we thank you so much for tuning in. Please be safe, be well, and we wish you and your families the best during these times. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. God bless you, and good night.
Thank you. Peace.
Doctor.